Today we're going to be looking at the Shores of Tripoli, which is a 2-player game with a solo variant. I'll be mostly talking about the 2-player game here as I'm considering covering the solo game separately. This game covers the First Barbary War between the US and Tripoli 1801 to 1805. It's a card-driven game mostly focused on naval conflict and the political events that played out throughout the war. It has completely asymmetrical play, it's fast-paced, easy to learn and teach, but hard to review because it's deeper than you'd probably think given its fairly simple rule set. With that said, let's jump in, let's check out the Shores of Tripoli. The Shores of Tripoli is played on a map spanning from Tangier to Alexandria. The circled spaces are called harbour zones, and the white spaces adjacent to some of these harbour zones are patrol zone spaces. There's also a space for the Tripolitan and US supply of frigates, the big ships, infantry cubes, Tripolitan corsairs, which are the smaller boats for the Tripolitan player, and the US gunboats, which are the smaller boats for the US. We'll start with Tripoli and see what they can do on their turn. They can play a card for an event. They read the card's text aloud and put it into play. I'll talk about events in more detail in this review a little later on. They can also discard a card from their hand to do one of two other options. They can build a corsair in Tripoli or pirate raid from Tripoli. Let's start with build a corsair. The Tripolitan player can take a corsair from their supply space and place it in Tripoli's harbour zone. Pretty easy stuff. They also have the option to discard a card to pirate raid from Tripoli. This is where they can move out into the open sea, which the open sea is any space on the board that isn't a harbour zone or a patrol zone, and this is where they can attempt to get gold coins from non-player character merchant ships. We move 4 corsairs here out into the open seas, rolling 1 die for each corsair present. On the roll of a 5 or a 6, they get a gold coin. If Tripoli get 12 gold coins, they win. Tripoli do have other winning conditions I'll talk briefly about later, but that's Tripoli's options per turn. Basic, right? They play an event, build a corsair in Tripoli, or pirate raid from Tripoli. Let's talk about the US and what they can do. They can play a card for an event just like Tripoli, or they can discard a card to do one of 2 other options as well, although these options differ to Tripoli's. They can build a gunboat in Malta, or move up to 2 frigates around the board, which may result in a battle depending on where they move to. If they build a gunboat in Malta, they take a gunboat from the supply space and place it into Malta. Again, it's that simple. They could also choose to move 2 frigates to any harbour zone or patrol zone on the board, and the 2 frigates don't have to move together. One can move from Gibraltar here to Tunis, another could move from, say, Malta to Tangier's harbour zone, for example. Now, if the US are game enough, they might move a frigate or frigates into a harbour zone like that of Tripoli's here, which is occupied by Tripolitan corsairs, and this would result in a naval attack, which the big ships, being the frigates, roll 2d6 each, and the little ships, gunboats and corsairs, roll 1d6. On the roll of a 6, they score a hit on the enemy's ships. Big ships have 2 hit points, little ships, being the corsairs and gunboats again, have only 1 hit point each. If the US successfully wipe out all units in Tripoli, including the infantry, they win. Now that's just a basic rundown of the mechanics and options to the players each turn. They're very simple, but as I stated earlier, each side, as you're sort of already starting to observe, are completely asymmetrical. They don't have the same discard options, they don't have the same winning conditions, and they're not even playing from the same deck of cards. You see, each player has their own deck of only 27 cards, and if the game goes the distance, which is 6 turns or 6 years as the game refers to them, each having 4 rounds of card play, or in game terms, seasons, each player will get access to every single card in their deck if the game goes a distance, with a shuffle in between. So sometimes they'll get access to events more than once. It's so asymmetrical it kind of feels like players are playing 2 different games. The only thing the players have in common is that they're playing on the same board, but make no mistake, don't let the components fool you here. This is a war game and there will be conflict. So let's look at how those differing options for each player interact and create some conflict. First of all, the US might choose to occupy a patrol zone in order to attempt to intercept the raiding Tripolitan corsairs there. You see, if the US player occupies a patrol zone where the Tripolitan player attempts to pirate raid from, The US player rolls 2d6 per US frigate present there, and on the roll of a 6, one Tripolitan Corsair is sunk before it gets a chance to pirate raid. And a reminder, 12 gold coins and Tripoli win, and there are only 12 gold coins in the game. So the US won't want to leave all these patrol zones empty. Tripoli will be hesitant to pirate raid if they have US resistance. Otherwise, they're very likely to run rampant and run out and get those gold coins. Now I should mention, through events, allied Tripolitan Corsairs, which are the Orange Corsairs, can show up at the Orange harbours, Tangier, Algiers and Tunis. And through further Tripolitan event cards, they can raid from these locations as well. So you can see how these simple mechanics are slowly coming together to be more interactive and deeper than you may have initially thought. But wait, there is more. Coming to a cinema near you. I apologise, that's a terrible American accent. Okay, let's move on. When the US player attacks a harbour zone with Tripolitan ships or allied Tripolitan ships in it, it results in a naval combat. And the US will get a chance here to bring along their gunboats that were sitting in Malta. And these gunboats offer another attack with 1d6, and probably more importantly, they act as another hit point for the US. You see, if the US lose 4 frigates, they lose the game immediately. And unlike pirate raid interception attacks, Tripoli can return fire in a naval attack with 1d6 for each Corsair, or 2d6 if they've got frigates available, but Tripolitan frigates won't always come into play. They come into play through an event. After one round of naval combat, though, between the US player and the Tripolitan player, the US player's fleet involved in the battle will return to Malta, all of them, and the remains of Tripoli's fleet would return to Tripoli's harbour zone. This is huge because there's an encouragement for the US to make the most out of attacks. The return to Malta means the US player will have to discard a card or play an event to move back in for another attack next turn, and more importantly, that Tripolitan patrol zone momentarily as they go back to Malta might be unoccupied, which a smart Tripolitan player will definitely want to take advantage of with a pirate raid without risking being intercepted. There are battle cards as well which can be played out of a player's traditional sequence of card play too, which can increase the odds of successful attacks, and it should be mentioned Tripoli have similar cards for pirate raids too. This game is not just naval battles though, mostly naval battles, but not only. You can see Dern over here only have infantry cubes. The US can attack these Tripolitan infantry units, and this is called a bombardment. Similar to naval combat, the US hit on 6s, but the infantry cubes won't get an opportunity to return fire. In fact, other than returning fire in naval combat, Tripoli don't have a direct way of achieving their goal of sinking 4 American frigates for a win. They have some events that can cause damage to US ships, but no discard option. I personally think the winning condition of sinking US frigates is mostly there to deter an over-aggressive US player, and by overly aggressive I mean completely reckless. And because this really encourages the US to build gunboats to soak up some of the Corsairs' return fire in naval combat, and it works quite well. Moving into attack with small amounts of frigates, sure, I mean they roll 2d6 each, but Tripoli's discard option to build Corsairs in Tripoli means it's not unusual to have sort of 6 Corsairs there. So 4d6 for the US versus 6d6 coming back, that's a pretty big risk to take. You're probably better off to wait for the Tripolitan player to pirate raid and then try and intercept them, where you will roll 4d6 and they won't return fire at all. However, if Tripoli have, say, 8 gold coins, which can happen quite regularly, you won't want Tripoli pirate raiding with 6 Corsairs, so maybe you do want to move in with those 4 frigates and try and knock some out in a more aggressive manner. However, if you move into the harbour zone to attack them, afterward you're going to go back to Malta, leaving Tripoli's patrol zone unprotected for the Tripolitan player next turn, who can now pirate raid freely. Decisions, decisions, decisions. Now, going back to bombardments, you might think to yourself, why attack infantry through a bombardment if there's no discard option to move them around or attack with them? Well, through events, the US player in the later turns of the game can build Hamet's army in Alexandria, then through events, move them into Dern, Benghazi, then into Tripoli for an all-out assault, winner takes all. There's a risk here though for the US. If Hamet's army is defeated in Dern, Benghazi or Tripoli, Tripoli will get the victory. And here's the big kicker. Infantry battles versus infantry battles are fought to the death. There's no returning to Malta, no retreats to friendly spaces, they're fought outright, and they're resolved in a similar fashion to naval combat and bombardments. Hits are applied on the roll of sixes, 1 dice for each infantry cube present, but endless rounds back and forth until one side is completely eliminated. So bombardments to attack infantry can reduce resistance there for Hamet's army to come through and take Tripoli for the win. A major note here, Hamet's army will likely be created in Alexandria every game. Why? The US and Tripoli have 3 core event cards available to them at all times. These events are really significant, and one of these is the creation of Hamet's army in Alexandria. However, the US player will have to have built an appropriate hand of cards to utilise him properly. As I mentioned, Hamet's army moves toward Tripoli via events, so the US will need to have built their hand to do this at the right time. The benefit again is, in this game you will get access to every card if the game gets this far, so you're going to have the opportunity to build this hand if it's part of your plan. Which brings me to hand management. You'll have a hand of cards at the start of each turn between 6 and 8. You will draw 8 cards at the beginning of each turn, with a hand limit of 8. Choosing which cards to discard to meet the hand limit is excruciating, because it's such a heavily event-driven game with such a small deck. The events have been refined so much that they pack a punch. So there's some really tough decisions to make in regards to which cards to discard, either to meet the hand limit or to participate in the general operations. Which general operations I know from this overview seem a bit dull decision-wise, but when used in conjunction with events, they can really bolster them and make much more of an impact than I've described here. There's also a genuine time pressure to achieve a win in this game, because both players will be pushing towards different victory conditions and instant winning conditions. And this is a good time to mention the US will have a treaty card in their deck, and it has a list of criteria. If the US player meets this criteria and plays the treaty event, which they can only play it in the later years of the game, they can win through achieving this treaty victory. There are a lot of ways to win in the shores of Tripoli, and therefore a lot of ways to lose. First things first, make no mistake, this game looks like a Euro game, but it most certainly feels like a war game, albeit a lighter one, but not light on the decisions presented to the players. The theme and the narrative really come through strong here, which I really enjoyed. Now, because of the events, the narrative, and Hamet's army likely to be, well, at least come into play every game, does it feel scripted? A little, yes, but I feel that it's the narrative that feels scripted, not the gameplay. It's varied enough to where games don't feel samey. Because of the small deck, certain events will likely play out every single game. It's a given. Hamet's army is likely to at least be created every single game, but he might not do much more than sit in Alexandria. The US player, as I said, might not have the cards to move him and utilise him properly, or there might be more pressing issues for them to address. So the US might shift gear, and they might abandon an option to move Hamet's army by discarding a card that would otherwise do that to protect a patrol zone that's unprotected, particularly if the Tripolitan player is getting a little rich and it looks like they might make a pirate raid soon. 8 to 10 coins held by the Tripolitan player in later rounds is quite common. So there's a lot of tense moments in the game as it progresses. And I think the narrative playing out the way it does encourages repeated plays, because the first few games, the players will just be getting their feet wet. The fun starts when you know what the other players are capable of through understanding what's in their deck. I've played it at least 10 times now, and I don't have the decks memorized. I know people would have the ability to do that much earlier on, but my mind just doesn't work that way. But I can recall enough, and I was able to, after the first maybe 2 or 3 games, I was able to recall enough as to where I could understand what my opponent was generally capable of with their deck, and that was enough for me. Now, the dice, dice and games don't bother me. That's, par for the course. If you are the US player because you need a 6 to hit more often than not, that can be rough. Battle cards that increase your odds cannot be overlooked. The battle cards, however, are quite often discarded for other uses because they only serve a purpose during a battle. And if there's not an imminent battle that is significant coming up, keeping them in your hand, they're sort of taking up valuable real estate, and you'll probably be more tempted to discard a battle event for operations over other event cards that will seem more appealing. Now, when a battle is fought to the death with infantry for the outcome of a victory, which that can happen, I've seen it get a bit dice festy where neither player can roll a 6 to eliminate the other, and it goes back and forth until one does. That doesn't bother me too much, because if there's 1 infantry left versus 1 infantry and it's the first to roll a 6, well, you've just had a really close game regardless. But I can imagine that'd piss some people off, coming down to a single die roll like that, and it can happen. It's not how most my games have been won, but it's certainly possible. Now, with all this asymmetrical play, how's the balance? I've heard people say it favours the Tripolitan player, and I'd say Tripoli has won most my games of it, but by like 60-40, not by an overwhelming amount. And it's usually in the last turns too. If it favours Tripoli at all, I've never seen the US at a loss where it's clear they can't come back. It's always been a tense game right up until a victory has been achieved. Again, that's usually in the last year too. It's not like Tripoli just have such an advantage they just, totally wipe the floor with the US. Components, I mean, you're not idiots. You can see they're absolutely fantastic. And I also appreciated, I had no real intricate details of the history of this game prior to getting a copy. It has a historical book which is separate and laid out beautifully, and it gave me great insight into the events of each year, which the turns are broken down to years, and I really appreciated that separate book, which gave me a lot of information. My only piece of criticism with the components was there was no player's aid, but there's one available on Board Game Geek. In actual fact, there's a few, and I found them very useful. I should also mention the Gamers on Rally the Troops, a great website for gaming. I'm only new to it, and a good deal of my experience with this game has been from playing games there, because through Board Game Geek I've met some like-minded gamers, but they're usually overseas, and I really appreciate that accessibility for someone like me who is in a bit more of a remote country. The solo variant, my experience with it so far is the solo variant has you set up a kind of timeline of Tripoli's cards, and as the US, you basically play it the same way you would that I've described here. But you'll go through this Tripolitan timeline to see if certain criteria have been met. So there's a bit of a memory aspect. You'll have to remember when certain events would be triggered by, something that you've done, in which the timeline will work through. And I didn't have a problem with that at all. That wasn't the issue. It's more that I can imagine if you bought it specifically for a solo game without the intention of ever playing it with two players, that could be a bit of a daunting start, because if you've not experienced some of the Tripolitan events two-player, where you're going through that deck quite quickly and seeing it, it'd be a bit of a daunting start to it. And because the gameplay in the solo variant follows that sort of timeline where you are actually following a bit more of a process, the gameplay as a result does feel more scripted. It's not completely set. I should mention that. It's not the whole deck is laid out in a timeline. There are random draws, but still the gameplay is a little more scripted than in a two-player game. But after a few plays, it definitely flows well. And this is a solo game. I certainly will play it again. There's definitely nothing wrong with the way it works. When I have played other solo games where I'm like, yeah, this is a bit tacked on, I don't think that's the case here, and I've not beaten the solo game yet. It's just that I think it's a much better two-player game. And it was like I was saying to my wife the other day, it's better with two, but if you're not up for it, it's nice I have, the option to play with myself. Now,